Hello and welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast where we help you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and with round 8 now completed, we are officially 1/3 of the way into the fantasy season. And it's at this time of year where the game does tend to slow down a touch and we see scoring increase. And this week provided some whoppers. 16 players went over 120, with 5 of them going over 130. So we're starting to see those ceiling scores more often, and the importance of having 1 or 2 of those guys with that sort of ceiling is really important and will be the difference in many matchups from here on till the end of the season, I'm sure. It was a decent round of footy. There were a fair few blowouts. We're starting to see that a little bit more often this year. A lot of one-sided games. But we had a couple of classics. Thursday night, North and Essendon. Yes, it wasn't the most skillful game you'll ever see, but it was a cracking contest. Good theatre. And then, Saturday night, Geelong Collingwood, one of the games of the year. It's not often, I reckon, there'd be non-Collingwood fans hoping for a Collingwood victory, but I reckon majority of people watching were hoping Jack Crisp kicked that goal at the end, just for the fairy tale to cap off, an incredible story after an incredible run of consecutive games. But he missed, and the Cats held on in a thriller, as they so often do. Got lots to get through on this episode. There are a lot of things I noticed across the round. We've got a heap of listener questions at the end of the episode as well. So let's just jump straight into the first segment and have a look at what I noticed in round 8. Starting on Thursday night with that great game between North Melbourne and Essendon. For the Bombers, I thought Nate Caddy really stood up, had a really good game, and he's continuing the trend of sort of like emerging key forwards who are just safe 70 guys. I've seen a lot of it come through this year. Guys like Georgiades, Tracy, obviously Jesse Hogan, Charlie Curnow, Mackay, they've done it in the past. And then obviously Thilthorpe, Sam Darcy. I'm just seeing a bit of a trend where it's almost the return of the key forward into fantasy relevance. Back in the day you would never touch a key forward, but I reckon particularly in keeper leagues it's really important to have 1 or 2 of these guys that you can build your forward line around and just bank on that 70 score every week. And Nate Caddy's really developing. I thought that was one of his better games. Zach Reid is a guy that, he's quite relevant in the classic formats as a cash cow. And for me, I've just been waiting for him to start scoring 40s and 50s as the normal, as a key defender, but he just keeps getting it done. Another 90 on the weekend. He was playing on the debutant for North, Finbar Maley, but he just keeps doing it, Reid, and he is pretty reliable, I reckon, now. Particularly now Jordan Ridley's gone down. I'm not sure what they're going to do with that back line, the makeup of it, but Zach Reid is locked away there, and he's good for a 60-70 most weeks, it seems. For North Melbourne, there's a guy named Riley Hardiman, second-year player. I didn't know much about him, and when he got called up a few weeks ago, Jimmy from Coaches Panel, the old Coaches Panel, in a group chat had said, just keep an eye on this guy. He's got a bit of a fantasy game in him. And I didn't know much about him, but watching him on the weekend, he did some nice things off of half-back. He took 7 marks, scored around 70 odd. He's just one for those deeper leagues to just have a look at, keep an eye on, or maybe grab him now and just stash him away, because I think North's backline, there's been a lot said about it, and they've been constantly sort of looking for a distributor out of there. They brought Zach Fisher across 18 months ago, and now they've got Caleb Daniel across, but I don't know if any of those guys are really scratching the itch of what North Melbourne need back there, and perhaps Riley Hardiman can develop into that in a few years' time. Finbar Maley, what a debut. And what a moustache he has. Great combo. His first mark and goal was just about the best first mark and goal you're going to see. He's an exciting prospect. had a chance to maybe win it at the end of the game, and then ran out of time with his kick, and it was called to play on, and then he couldn't get the distance. So he'll learn from that. But yeah, I thought he was super impressive. I think North fans would be really excited to see what he had put out in his first game, and hopefully we see more of him. Friday night, we saw the Saints just absolutely wrap Freo up and not let them breathe. Certainly didn't let them score much. Callum Wilkie is someone who's had a good couple of years as a pretty consistent defender that can, get you a 70 to 80 on a good week. But he popped a huge score on the weekend, a 120. And he does go high pretty like that every now and then. But the reason I brought him up, I heard on the call in the game, before that game on Friday night, Callum Wilkie had played 100% time on ground in every game this season. And I don't know, that seems so unusual to me in the modern game. I know back in the day you'd have these fullbacks who would never leave the field, but with all the rotations that the modern game has, it's pretty impressive when a player does that. And I guess the reason I bring it up is, yeah, he's a key defender and he's not going to go 120 every week, but if you've got a guy who's literally never off the ground, there's a pretty good chance he's going to be scoring points at any point of the game. So I reckon he's a pretty good guy to have, as a D3, D4 perhaps. But yeah, that time on ground is incredible. And I think he actually hit the pine at some point on Friday night just to end that record. Hugh Boxall was another debutant this weekend for the Saints. After some really strong VFL form, we finally got a look at him. And he just looked like he'd been playing AFL all season. Didn't look overawed. Had a huge first half. I reckon he was on 60 at halftime, which had the whole fantasy world, tongues wagging. But slowed down, and I think he finished on 74. Just a hard tackler, hard-nosed, put himself in the right spots, and I think pretty exciting prospect. So hopefully, he'll keep his spot for sure, but hopefully he gets a good run at it and we can really get a feel for what he's going to be. Cooper Sharman, I don't really know what to make of that game. That he was playing, I don't want to say out of his skin, but I've certainly never noticed him to the level I noticed him on the weekend. He was a real big, not game breaker, but he really did help end any chance Freo had of getting back in the game. Not that they were showing any signs of life. A career game for him, surely. I'm not sure if we'll see more of that in terms of his scoring in fantasy, but I reckon he's very much gone from being a fringe player to an important player, particularly with the forward woes that St Kilda have. For Fremantle, it was a dirty night for the Dockers, but a couple of players caught my eye. Corey Wagner, he scored 94, second game back in the side. I think he was a 70 last week and 94 this week. And it's interesting, the score build for this guy, because I've kind of always thought of Corey Wagner as a high mark type of player. Not like a seagull, but certainly someone who would build most of his fantasy scores around +6s, the mark kick. But it was the strangest thing on the weekend. He scored a 94, he took no marks, and he laid 16 tackles, which is huge. Last week, he, I think, laid 5 tackles and only took 1 or 2 marks. So, yeah, since he's come back into the side, he's gone from being more of a kick mark guy to a contested tackling machine, it would seem. I'm not sure. It's interesting to just see what happens next with him. He has had a handful of centre bounce attendances in the last fortnight. So, yeah, maybe he's moving towards a bit more midfield action, which would be great for his scoring. And, at 28, at his third club, he'd be looking to lock in a spot now. And, Freo have an unfortunate injury to Hayden Young, which could potentially impact Wagner, but possibly impacting the next guy I'm going to speak about even more. And that's Matt Johnson, who has just been, it feels like forever, but, it hasn't been, but a couple of years now of him on a wing, having little looks at the inside game and being pretty handy. But yeah, he's gone back-to-back 90s now, And we did see some extra mid-time for him with Hayden Young going out. Young's going to be out long-term, I believe, with a hammy, but I think it's going to be a long hammy because they're going to take extra long to get him right. In fact, yeah, I reckon we don't see Young till after the buys. So there's opportunities for a spot there, whether it's Wagner getting a little bit more, whether it's Matt Johnson getting a bit more. Do we see Neil Erasmus come back in? And they've still got O'Meara to come back in as well. So interesting mix. We'll see what happens with that Hayden Young injury and what it means. On to Bulldogs and Port Adelaide in Ballarat, and this was a very one-sided game. It was great to see Adam Treloar finally return for his first game of the season. The number one averaging midfielder from last season, finally back into the side, played a mid-forward role and scored 90. And I thought it was interesting what the coach, Luke Beveridge, said before the game about the midfield mix. And he basically flagged that Treloar would play a bit more forward because he's hesitant to break up what's working. So I thought that was an interesting thing to say. And then, it being Bevo, I was curious to see if it actually went that way. But it did. He was telling the truth, old Bevo. Treloar had 7 centre bounce attendances, playing mostly forward, and obviously scored the 90. But I guess the interesting thing about that is, does he get forward status? And then what sort of numbers can we expect him to average playing in that role? 90 was great on the weekend, but it was a big win for the Doggies. So, yeah, he's going to be an interesting watch in the next couple of weeks. And then, if he can get going and pick up forward status, he's almost someone that if he scores a bit average this week, could be the sort of player to target in a trade if you're contending and you need someone in the forward line, because if he picks up forward status and catches fire in the second half of the year, wouldn't it be amazing to have him sitting at your F1 spot? Aaron Norton had another good game, scoring in the 90s. He has had 2 90s now since Sam Darcy went down. So I'm very interested in him. He just needs to get those stinky scores out of his system to trust him on field, but keep watching him. I think he's going to continue to build. And then on to Saturday Twilight, where we saw the Crows get back into form with a big win over Carlton. I was a bit worried about this game as a Crows fan, just with some of the outs we had and the form of Carlton. But, when the Crows are in that form at their home deck, they're pretty hard to stop. It was great to see. And there were plenty of big scores for the Crows. The one that probably stood out the most was Max Michaelini with a career-high 116. Now, I reckon a couple of years ago, I could see this guy developing into maybe being that intercept distributor that the Crows could do with, but he's also so good as a lockdown. So he's kind of been in between the two types of players the last few years, almost depending on matchup. But on the weekend, we saw what he can do when he's, not loose, but more free. And there were plenty of marks, plenty of involvement in lots of chains out of D50. I don't know if he's going to score like that again, but keep an eye on him, because if he's starting to move into being that type of player, he is I reckon he could be a gun for us in the future. Wayne Miller has been up and down in his return this year, but he looked really solid on the weekend. He had 27 touches, and that's the most he's had in a game since round 22, 2023. And as we know, he's missed a lot of footy. So for him to get through, the first 7-8 rounds of the year and still be healthy, to put up a score in the 90s and to rack up the ball like he did, it's a good sign, and I think he's going to continue on with it. He's just been a bit up and down, so he's one that you'd like to probably loophole if you could. Sam Berry, he's always been a favourite of mine since that year in 2021 where he led the AFL in tackles. He just hasn't gotten anywhere near those levels ever since, through a number of reasons, injuries and just timing. Whenever the timing has been right, he's been out of form or injured. But with Matt Crouch out for the next, 4 weeks or whatever it is, Berry could be an interesting watch. He came out, he was a sub on the weekend, came on in the last quarter, got plenty of the ball. He looked much faster than I remembered. I don't know if it's because he cut his hair at the start of the year, but he just looked zippier. And the Crows are desperate for someone with a bit more pace than Matt Crouch. And I think Berry brings those qualities. If he's added a bit of zip, his ability to win the ball is a clearance player. I don't know. I hope the Crows give him 4 quarters. That's what he needs. He needs 2 or 3 weeks without the sub-vest, playing in that Matt Crouch role, and let's just see what he can do. I'll be watching him closely. And for Carlton, it was a disappointing day and very disappointing score from Tom De Koning. Just a really poor effort from him on the day. Got beaten by Riley O'Brien. An interesting stat, though, I saw during the weekend, that no ruckman has scored a ton against Rob this season, which is interesting. Does that fully excuse De Koning's 65? Probably not. But, I don't know. I wonder if Pitnet is just around the corner. That's going to be a very interesting wait and see for Carlton fans and for Tom De Koning owners. On to Saturday night. What a great game that was. Cats and the Pies, haven't they had some crackers over the years? This was up there with the very best. Lachie Schultz back in the side after a few weeks out, and another solid score with a 93. I think he laid a bunch of tackles to get there this time, but he's just been a fantastic pickup if you grabbed him this year. Just compared to his output last year, he's really doing some good things, and to miss a few weeks with injury and then slot straight back in with a 93 says a lot about him. Darcy Cameron, pretty underrated season, I reckon. I'm not hearing many people talk about him. I think, over in the classic formats, people would be just a little hesitant to trust him, but he just keeps on doing it. He's the most consistent ruck of the season, I would have thought, in fantasy scoring, and had an absolute monster game up against Geelong, who do often concede high ruck scores. A couple of cats before I start talking about the ruck line for them. Mitch Duncan, first game for the season. Good to see him back. And he slotted into the Tom Stewart role, scored 79 from 59% time on ground in a very friendly role. So obviously you'd expect those minutes to go up. And if he can stay in that role, I think, it's not going to be the huge days of Mitch Duncan in the past playing in that role, but there's no reason why he can't get up to 80s and 90s every week. So, he's going to be a watch. I grabbed him in a couple of draft comps I'm in, keeper and draft, and, I was pretty happy to see him. Max Holmes spent a bit more time at half-back this week, but just still isn't getting the scores. Again, it's not, I feel like I complain about this guy every week. It's not that he's scoring really poorly. It's just that I thought after season 2024 he was ready to go to that next scoring step in fantasy, and just feels like he's gone backwards a bit. And I did hear that potentially he was carrying some sort of niggle, so he could be the sort of guy that catches fire after the buys, maybe after a breather. Maybe you could target him in your leagues then. Now, Geelong Rucks. So I finally let Sam De Koning go out of my keeper league, my home league. I've had him since the start of the year, and I just think those constant weeks of him scoring in the 50s and not attending any ruck contests probably tells you all you need to know. So I let him go, and then watching Saturday night, lo and behold, Reece Stanley gets injured. That was my biggest fear about letting De Koning go. What if Stanley gets injured? I actually said that before the game. Can you believe it? Anyway, it happened, and we should believe it. Stanley does get injured. So I had my head in my hands thinking, what have I done? He's going to go back into the ruck and dominate. Not dominate, but, fantasy scores. And then it was the strangest thing. Blitzarves went into the ruck and was supported by Neil. And that was it from quarter time onwards. De Koning had a couple of goes in the ruck around the ground, but Dangerfield actually attended more ruck contests than De Koning. So that made me feel better. But the question now is, who will be Geelong's main ruck this week against the Giants? And Chris Scott said post-game that he's not sure what they're going to do there because Conway isn't going to be playing. And obviously Stanley, I think it was a hammy. So, you're looking at a few weeks there. So they're playing GWS. Kieran Briggs has been out of form, but is a pretty formidable opponent, I would have thought. He picked up a niggle in his game. I think he's okay. But if he happened to be out and the Giants play a backup ruckman, maybe Geelong say, all right, let's put DeConning back in there for one more week. Or if Briggs plays, do they say, no, we'll stick with Blitzarves with Neil as the support because we really need DeConning to go on to Jesse Hogan or Cadman, who looked good on the weekend. So I have no idea, but I know that I want him back because if he goes into the ruck and I just let him go, I'll be spitting chips. Ocean Mullen tagged Nick Dacos for the whole game, and Dacos was pretty good, but certainly scoring-wise, he missed the ton for the first time in a while, so props to Mullen and probably a sign of things to come for opponents coming up against Geelong that they've found another tagger there. And then lastly in this game, Patrick Dangerfield, I mean, what more can be said about this guy? His performances this year, and particularly in this game against Collingwood that last quarter, it's just more than what someone should be doing at this stage of his career. And I didn't think Dangerfield would be adding to his legacy in season 2025, but he absolutely is. He's playing brilliant football in the forward line, moving into the midfield when needed. And I tell you what, if he doesn't play on the weekend, the Cats don't beat Geelong, and I reckon probably the same thing in Gather Round a few weeks ago when he was really important in the win over Adelaide. So yeah, what a man. If you jumped on him early this season, just thinking, forward status could be handy, you would be over the moon with what he's doing. The other Saturday night game saw West Coast put in a decent effort, I think, early against Melbourne, but looks like they got run over fairly easily in the end. Some players that took my attention. Ryan Marrick, great to see. He slowed down. I don't think he touched it much in the last quarter, but great to see a career score from him, a second ton for him. He's been a pretty handy player as a forward eligible guy, but I think the last 4 or 5 weeks he's just scored in the 70s, which is, handy, but just nice for owners to get a good reward, a nice ton from him. And I think McGovern was concussed, so he might be out of the side again, which just means, more opportunity for Marrick. Brady Hoff, disappointing to say the least. Talked about him a week ago. Going into the midfield, picking up the centre bounces, and, maybe that's what's going to unlock him as a fantasy player for us. And he just couldn't get the ball on the weekend. The role was the same, though. So I'm confident he could bounce back this week. I thought perhaps Tim Kelly's return was going to impact him, but it certainly didn't affect his centre bouncer tendencies. It was actually Hutchinson who was completely shifted out of the CBA rotation, and he attended 0. So a bit of movement there, but Hoff, I don't know what that game was, but like I said, the role was there, and let's see how he goes this week. In the same game, got to talk about the Finders Keepers Player of the Week, Max Gawn. And I generally try to keep this award to sort of younger players, just to be in the theme of what keeper leagues are all about, the young talent. But how could you go past the great man? He scored 158 off of 35 disposals, which I think was a career high, 8 marks, a goal, and 47 hitouts. No tackles. He scored 158 without laying a tackle. Unbelievable. And just shows you what sort of game he had. He was just cruising around up against Matty Flynn. Just incredible, Gawn. He's just doing it again this year, isn't he? And he's on track, I think, to get another All-Australian blazer, and that would take him to an equal record 8 for his career. And there are 5 other players currently who have won 8 All-Australian spots. Robert Harvey, Mark Rasciuto, Buddy Franklin, Gary Ablett Jr. and Patrick Dangerfield. So good chance that Gawn joins that group, and there's actually a good chance Dangerfield goes one better and picks up a 9th the way he's going too. Kate Chandler had a huge score. It's actually 2 weeks in a row he's put up really good scores. He did it earlier in the year, and I know a few would have jumped on him, and then he just sort of did nothing for the weeks after. So I had a bit of a look. He's scored over 93 times this season, playing as that high half forward who gets involved. But those 3 games were against the Kangaroos, the Tigers, and the Eagles. So the 3, bottom sides that he has gone big on. So I guess that probably tells you a little bit about it. I'd like to see him put up a decent score this week up against the Hawks before I'm convinced that he could be trusted. On to Sunday's games, we had the Giants and the Swans, Sydney getting up. There wasn't a whole lot in that game that I took notice of, but Joe Fonte played an impressive game. I think it was his first for the season for the Giants. He played a handful of games last year. But he played off half-back and he scored 70 and looked to be a pretty decent role. And I'm guessing he's probably taken Connor Stone's spot for the time being. So based on the numbers and what I've heard about the game, I think he keeps his spot, and I think he'll play that role again. So, we know GWS like to score points from their halfbacks. Whitfield and Lockie Ash can attest to that. So, yeah, it could be interesting to see what Fonte can do if he stays in the side. And then Toby McMullen, nothing in a scoring point of view, but just an interesting observation. 54% CBAs. He had a few last week as well. So they're just trying to get a bit of a different mix in there, clearly. And, Toby Bedford going off at half-time helped McMullen get those spots. The Hawks and the Tigers was another game on Sunday. I didn't have a chance to watch any of this one, but it looked to go fairly according to the script. Hawks just too good. A couple of names in this game. Henry Huswaite. I talked about him getting that opportunity a couple of weeks ago when Connor Nash was suspended. And then, he played midfield last week, scored a 70. And then just before this weekend, Cam McKenzie went out with a fractured hand. So there's a lot of Hawthorn mids out of the side now. And that just means the opportunity for Huswaite continues. And he looked good on the weekend. Plenty of mid-time. Scored really well thanks to 8 tackles. I think he only had 4 kicks, maybe something like 11, 12 handballs. But it was the 8 tackles that got him up there. And, Sam Mitchell commented on him post-game again, saying he's just fitted into the AFL game straight away. So I do think we'll see plenty more of him in the coming weeks, and hopefully he can keep building, because I reckon he'll be a great scorer in the future. Chankuth Giath had a huge game for the Hawks. And I don't know if it's, the fact it was against Richmond and lots of their players got involved, or is this the start of something for CJ? A few years ago, I was really big on him. I thought he had the dash and the carry and the qualities to not only be a really good player for Hawthorn, but a high-scoring player in the fantasy world. And then, injuries and form and a few things have just sort of held him back. This was the first time we've seen him put it all together in a game, and he's just electric when he's up and running. So very interested to watch him again this week and see if he's about to turn into someone we could trust on the field. Luke Traynor for Richmond. This was his first game with Noah Bolter where he wasn't the sub. And if you recall that crazy game when they beat the Suns, he was the sub and came on, I think, with 5 minutes left to go in the last quarter. So good to see a full game with them. I know Bolter had some injury concerns, may have come off the ground at times. But the point remains, they played together and this trainer kid just keeps getting it done. Another 87, great score. And I think he's someone who, put up some good scores earlier in the year and showed he could be a fantasy prospect. But I just didn't know if he was someone you could carry on your list unless he was scoring. And he's scoring. You could definitely have him on your field. I didn't think I'd say that a month ago, but definitely he's doing enough. And then the final game of the round, Sunday night. How good's Sunday night footy, by the way? I love Sunday night footy. I would love to see that every week instead of the twilight spot. But that is because I have kids who keep me from watching games during the day, and I love the night games. But I don't know. I just think it's cool. Sunday night, you're a bit bummed. The weekend's over. Back to work tomorrow. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, hold on. There's a game of footy tonight. Anyway, it wasn't a great game in the end. It was the Q Clash. And it was the first Q Clash in their history. So that's Q Clash 28. So that's the 28th time they've played. And that's the first time they've played and both the Lions and the Suns have been in the 8. Isn't that crazy? So I was pretty excited about this one, but in the end, Brisbane just, too experienced. And I think Gold Coast were okay. I think they'll learn a lot from the game that will hold them in good stead for perhaps another game with the Lions later in the season. Nothing too exciting in this game unless you happen to own someone with the last name Ashcroft. Will Ashcroft got the medal named after his dad. It was a real Ashcroft fest watching this game. But Levi I want to talk about. He scored the first of what I'm sure is going to be a lot of fantasy tons across his career. And hasn't he just been brilliant? I mean, he would have gone number 1 in most redrafts, particularly if it was taken after the Jagger Smith injury. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that he's good. I think my surprise is, coming into a premiership side and playing every game and just immediately becoming an important member of the team. The interesting thing I hadn't realised about Ashcroft, because when I saw he got his ton, I thought, all right, I wonder if he had a heap of centre bounces this week. He's not attended a single centre bounce for the Lions this year. Not one. And look, that makes sense because he's a first-year player and Brisbane's midfield is pretty chockers with talent. But I guess it just makes me think, wow, if this kid is already scoring the way he's scoring and he's yet to even get exposed to the midfield, he's going to have some sort of career. 2 more players quickly and then we will move on to my waiver wire pickups for the week. Mac Andrew is a guy I rated really highly in pre-season. The scoring hasn't been there, but he finally put up a decent score on the weekend. And he's just great to watch. He reminds me a little bit of Josh Weddle in terms of, I don't know where his best position's going to be, but wherever he goes on the ground, he's dynamic and does exciting things, whether it's forward, taking a big mark, kicking a goal, or playing as a key back and getting those long arms over for a punch to spoil a mark that you were sure was going to be taken by the forward. He's just got it all, this guy, and once he settles in a spot, we'll get a better idea of if he's going to be relevant for us in the fantasy world, but I think he will. I just don't know when or even where on the park. Probably in the back line. And then lastly, speaking of the Gold Coast backline, they brought over John Noble from Collingwood, and he has been fantastic. He's really scoring nicely. He's just so interesting because I've noticed every week at half-time, I think John Noble's going to score a 150. Like, he is absolutely everywhere in the first halves, and then he slows down in the second halves. And I've been saying it for weeks. So I thought I'd put together the actual numbers to see if what I think has been happening is happening. And the results are that in first halves this season, for the Gold Coast, Noble is averaging 60 in the first halves and averaging 35 in the second half. Probably not as big a split as I'd thought, but it's really interesting. So he's on average on 60 at half time every week. It's incredible. So I guess my point is if he can if he can find a way to stay in the game in the second halves, he's going to be a huge scorer for us. I mean, he already is, 95 average. Owners would be stoked. But it's just interesting that there's more there if he can just stay in the game longer. Now, before I wrap up this segment, I did want to talk about a couple of guys from the VFL this week that really stood out. The first one is Kadeen Coleman, who played his first game since that terrible ACL injury he had at the start of last year, which saw him miss all of 2024, including the Premiership. And he's had a delayed start. But it's good to see him back, and he killed it. He had 28 touches, 10 marks, and scored 127. So great news for Coleman owners. I don't think it's going to be long till we see him back in the senior squad. And the other guy I want to talk about is someone that just can't be ignored anymore. And that's Braden Fiorini. Now, most who have played the game will know Fiorini well. Way back in the day, in his second ever game, he scored, I think, 166. Ludicrous. But he just hasn't been able to keep a spot in the Gold Coast side. And when he does, he tends to play wing and not really score all that well. Anyway, have a listen to what this guy is doing in the twos. His last 4 scores in the VFL go like this: 156, 189, 170, and then on the weekend, 210. That's a 4-round average of 181. That is just mind-boggling numbers. And, you know, Gold Coast's going okay without him, but surely that's enough to see him get into the senior squad at some point soon. He's been an emergency for a few weeks, and I'm not expecting him to score like that in the seniors, because when he does come in, he tends to play wing. And, I think I'd like to see him on the ball. But anyway, we'll see what Gold Coast do with him, but I just couldn't ignore his numbers anymore. That's 4 weeks in a row, and then to go 210. Outrageous stuff from Fiorini. All right, I knew there was a lot to get through. That was a big segment. I'll move on now to my waiver wire pickups. 5 names that I think are a good chance to be available. And if you can get your hands on them, they're worth a waiver wire pickup. Sam De Koning is the first one. I reckon a lot of coaches would have done what I did this week or in recent weeks and let him go back to the pool, just with that defensive role looking to be clearly the preferred role for him, and there are no points there. But Reece Stanley's hurt his hamstring, he's out, and the Cats are looking for a number 1 ruck again. So if it does fall to De Koning, you want him in your side. The next guy is Hugh Boxall from St Kilda, 18-year-old, played his first game, scored 74 from pretty low time on ground, 59%. So if that increases, he's going to be a good scorer for us, I reckon. Matt Johnson from Freo, I think he's worth grabbing if he's around. He scored a 90 last week, so he may have been picked up already, but if he's still floating around, I'd grab him. Just with Hayden Young out, I reckon there's a chance he could get a little bit more of the inside game, which is just what he needs to flesh out his scoring to be someone that you're comfortable fielding week to week. Sam Berry for the Crows, probably a bit of a longer shot, but I do feel like this could be his last chance to cement a spot in that midfield with Matt Crouch out for the next 4 to 5 weeks. And then it's a similar theme with Henry Hustwaite as well. Hawthorn have a lot of midfielders out. He's been given 2 weeks at it. He only scored a 70 last week. Perhaps people ignored him and he's still available. I'd be grabbing him this week though. He looks like he belongs at the level. On to the listener questions now. We've got a few this week. Some good trades to review as well. So looking forward to that. Don't forget, if you've got an interesting trade that's happened in your league in the past and you want me to read it out on the podcast and review it for you, just send me a message or comment on X at FindKeepAFL, the Finders Keepers X page, and make sure you like the page to keep up to date with everything that's going on with the podcast. The first question, well, it's no question, it's a trade, has been sent in by @StonecuttersFC on X. And they say a couple of trades that went through in our league back in the day. And I love these old trades. You have to go back and look at what the players were averaging at that time, which I've done. Anyway, first one he has is 2018, Jordan De Goey for Dylan Roberton. And that was 1 week before Roberton's heart issues started. So obviously, pretty unfortunate for whoever grabbed Roberton. But I think an interesting one at the time, De Goey would have been, really young. And Roberton was a pretty handy scorer in the back line. So interesting trade there. And then going a couple of years even further back, 2016, someone in his league traded Jack Revolt for Tom Mitchell. And that was just before Mitchell went bananas for 5 years straight. So I had a look at this one and I thought, how could that happen? Jack Revolt for Tom Mitchell. So I went back to the time, 2016. Jack Revolt was averaging for a few years there in the high 70s, which is pretty good. It's, a great score, especially back then for a key forward. And obviously Richmond were a good side, so there were probably plenty of games where Revolt kicked a bag. And then I looked at Tom Mitchell. He'd had a couple of seasons of averaging 100 for Sydney, but he was just so... it was interesting the way John Longmire used him back then. I recall him being a sub candidate often, and then he'd come in and, knock the lights out in the fantasy sense, but then would be dropped back to the twos. So I guess looking back, it's a pretty wild trade, Revolt for Tom Mitchell, but it was at a time where it kind of made sense. 100 mid for nearly 80 forward, and the 100 mid, there was no guarantees that he'd ever get a run at it. As it happened, Tom Mitchell moved to Hawthorn, started averaging 120s as a minimum for a long stretch. He had a couple of huge years, won a Brownlow. And Jack Revolt was good. I think he went on to have an average in the 80s, one of those years. But clearly looking back, whoever got Tom Mitchell in that deal would have had a very, very good 5 years of scores. And Stonecutters finishes up saying, loving the podcast. Nice to have some specific keeper draft content on the airwaves. Thank you, Stonecutters FC. I love those trades you've sent through. It's always fun going back down memory lane and looking at players back then. And thanks for your kind words about the podcast. I'm glad you're enjoying it and really appreciate those who have written in to say they're enjoying the content. And just it's great to hear and makes me want to just make it even better. So keep that feedback coming through. On to the next question from @Ethan_Prendy on X. So that's Ethan Prendergast, who has put through a heap of trades that he pulled off in the preseason that I'm going to try and work through for you now. So Ethan says, hey Jordox, really love your work. The pod is elite. Thought I'd send you a couple of trades I made this off-season. For context, I was stuck in no man's land around 10th in a 16-man league, and I decided to go all in and push for a flag and needed a number of trades to do it. And he did a number of trades, all right. I'll go through that in a sec. But first, Ethan, thanks again, for the kind words. Glad you're enjoying the podcast. And I love that you've just decided, you're not sure if you're rebuilding, not sure if you're contending. You've just decided, I'm going for it and I'm going all in. So let's have a look at what Ethan did. In the first trade he's got here, he brought in Lockie Ash, Keziah Pickett, pick 2, pick 13, and gave away Tim Membry, Alex Sexton, picks 7, 22, 38, and his future first. Well, look, on paper, on first, sort of looking and hearing that, you've cleaned up, Ethan. I mean, you've brought in Lockie Ash, who, is performing at a level that maybe those didn't expect it in pre-season. Same with Kozzy Pickett. He's been a bit off the last 2 weeks, but he's looking like having a career season. And then pick 2, which you used on Jagger Smith, and pick 13, which you used on Taj Houghton. So you got Ash, Cozzy Pickett, Jagger Smith, Taj Houghton, and you've given up picks 7, 22, 38, your future first, Tim Membry and Alex Sexton. I mean, those two names, Membry and Sexton, I don't think hold a lot of value. Membry's been great for Collingwood, but Sexton, I don't think he's even playing at the moment. So I think, trade 1 is a big tick for you. The next one was you brought in Nick Blakey and pick 14 for Bailey Scott, pick 70, and a future second. I think this one's a lot more even. Nick Blakey and Bailey Scott, pretty similar, I would have thought, in pre-season. Blakey's been great. Bailey Scott's been dropped. Came back on the weekend as a sub, but I do think once he gets going again, he's going to be a handy player. And then the picks, it was 14 for 70 and a future second. And you've used pick 14 on Lombard, Leo Lombard. So, yeah, I reckon that's pretty good. Pick exchange as well. I mean, it's interesting because you've gone, for the flag, but you're pulling in some pretty good draft picks at the same time. So, you're shoring up the future as well, which is great. I reckon that trade is pretty fair. I'd say that's a win-win. And then the final trade that Ethan pulled off, this is where it gets a little bit crazy. He brought in Errol Goulden and Dan Houston for James Worpel, Fogarty, I'm guessing it's Darcy Fogarty, 2 future firsts and a future second. So Goulden and Houston for Worpel, Fogarty, 2 future firsts and a future second. That is a good deal for you. Goulden, I know, clearly got that long-term injury, which is painful for you, but Houston, they're 2 absolute guns, particularly Goulden for the long term and Houston for right now particularly. Giving up Worpel, he's been handy. Fogarty hasn't really developed into a safe scorer just yet as a key forward. And then, those future picks are going to be important in the future, but not right now. So all up, I think the first trade you did very well, and I think you came out on the right side. The second trade, I think, was a win-win, but that last trade, picking up Goulden and Houston, I think you've wiped the floor with the other coach there. But in saying that, the other coach may be building a huge amount of draft picks to really attack next year. But still, I wouldn't have given up Goulden for any of that. In fact, I probably wouldn't have given him up for anything. But that's okay. We all play the game a different way, and I'm sure the guys you dealt with got what they wanted and have a plan for what they're doing with their lists moving forward. Ethan also says, made some other trades around the league, but these were the most interesting ones. I'm currently 4th at 5-2 and feeling great. How would you view these deals, and are they as much as a scam as my league mates believe I pulled over the other players? I reckon maybe 2 of the 3 you could argue were not a scam. You just played it very well and pulled off some pretty good trades for your side. And it's an interesting thing in leagues, isn't it? If there's always trades that go through, and sometimes people are a bit annoyed. They think, oh, you've really, taken advantage of that coach and pulled the wool over their eyes. But you know what? That's part of the game. Like, a big part of being successful in keeper and dynasty leagues is your ability to negotiate trades that are favourable to your side. It's not easy. You've got to take the time to understand your squad, understand the other squads, know the players, and then when you're negotiating, have the ability to pitch it in a way where it is sounding favourable to the other coach. And if you can master that, you'll pull off some very nice trades like Ethan has. Thanks for sending them in, mate. That's some solid work from you, and I'm glad it's getting you some results on the board, and looks like you're on your way to finals, so all the best. All right, 2 more quick ones, and then we will wrap up what has been a big episode of Finders Keepers. At Nicholas Davis 86 on X, Nick Davis has written, "Hey Jordox, Nico, friend of the pod here," which is pretty weird. I've never heard of this guy. No, I'm joking. Nick's a very good friend of mine, and he's in my home keeper league, and he was asking me this question on the phone the other day, and I said, hey, send it to Finders Keepers and I'll give you a detailed response. And he has. Nick says, I've owned and appreciated Archie Roberts for some time, but I know little about him beyond his scores and age. Is he halfback? Is he wing? What's his value and where will he play in his prime? So Roberts was a pretty late draft pick, I'm pretty sure, in the 2023 draft. Didn't debut until late in the season last year. And, you know, clever coaches would have noticed him. I mean, he scored well, but it wasn't just the scores. It was watching him play and just thinking straight away, this guy has got fantasy game oozing out of him. So fair play to Nico because he grabbed him and held him over the summer. Now, Roberts started the season more on a wing than halfback, which affected his scoring in the first few weeks and maybe would have been a bit of a concern for owners. But he has now sort of shifted to that halfback role a bit more. And there's no coincidence his scoring has increased as a result of that. In terms of his value and you know, what he's going to be long term, I mean, I look at this guy. He's 19 years old. He's played 11 games of AFL and has averaged 84 fantasy points in those 11 AFL games. There's a little bit of Alex Witherden about the way his fantasy scores have started so strong. But I don't think he's going to have the same career or lack thereof that poor old Withers had. He's looking like being the long-term guy for that halfback role at Essendon. If you look at what's there at the moment, you've got Mason Redman, who's dropped a bit, is a bit off the boil in the last couple of years. Jordan Ridley is just always injured, unfortunately. Andy McGrath's inconsistent. They got Saad El Hawley, but clearly he's not ready yet, and I think he's been playing a bit on wing as well. So I think there's a spot there for him. He took Dyson Heppel's Guernsey number this year. That's always a good sign. So in terms of value, I mean, I think it's as high as value as you can almost get for a young defender. To be that young and have that scoring average already, it's just about whether he keeps that role, and I think the role is going to be there for him long term. There is the potential with Harry Jones going out with his ankle injury. There is a chance maybe Roberts goes back to a wing, but I think long term he will be, as I said, the halfback guy. Bombers have some other guys who could come in. They've got Lewis Hayes. He might finally get a debut with the Jordan Ridley injury. And then you've also got Zach Johnson, who's been doing good things in a halfback type role in the VFL. So he might be coming in as well. So in the short term, yeah, the role might switch a little bit around. But I think long term, Nick, you've got a guy who's got fantasy prowess, and I think down the track could be one of the most highly desired defenders in the game. It's just if you can hold him for a few years while he's probably going to be up and down with 80s before he really bursts out and becomes a big scoring primo. Of course, the problem with me talking him up so much is it now means I probably won't be able to go after him in a trade because Nick knows exactly what I think. But that's okay. Thanks for putting the question in, Nico. And I've got one more from another guy in my home league, another good mate in Ray. And he wanted to put the question forward last week. And it goes like this. Contending team looking for an older, solid D1, D2, such as Zorko, Short, Whitfield. What ageing defenders would you target for a contending team? And what sort of draft capital would you be giving up? 8-team league, 30 players, keep 20. It's a great question, and Ray and I are actually in a similar boat. I've been trying to get my hands on a reliable defender. I feel like defenders have been hard to find this year. If you've got them, you've probably had more trade requests for defenders than you can remember in recent years because they're just hard to find at the minute, and the good ones are, very valuable. So I guess the point Ray's making is, can you get a gun defender who's aging from a side that doesn't probably need that guy this year? And what sort of draft capital would you give up? So in terms of players to target, Ray, I mean, in our league that me and Ray are in, I was able to get James Sicily in a trade this week for Sam Durham, who I think is going to be a good player, but I've just got plenty of those young mids, and I really needed a dependable defender, and I got Sicily in, who scored a nice ton on debut, which was nice. So that's obviously a good example, a Sicily type. Now, Ray's mentioned Zorko, Short, Whitfield. I don't think you're going to be able to get Whitfield from anyone, even someone that doesn't need him, unless you're giving up significant player on return. Probably similar with Zorko, but I don't mind the Short one. I think Jaden Short's a good player to target. He's 29. He's certainly not, a guy with a long future in the game, clearly, especially as a fantasy scorer, but he's a pretty safe guy to have. He's been a little underwhelming this year. I just think you could get him off a coach for slightly less than what he's worth, and he'd be a great, maybe not D1, D2, but he'd be a high-end defender you can get for cheap that'll help you in your chase for success this year and next. A couple other guys like Tom Stewart will never be cheaper. For anyone who owns him, he would just be such a headache at the moment, and I think you'd be able to pick him up. If you've got someone in your league who has Tom Stewart and they're not contending this year, they'd be silly not to try and cash in on him, even though his value is at an all-time low. So perhaps go after someone who has Tom Stewart, and then I guess if you're a Tom Stewart owner, just wait till he's back on his side and scores decent, because, it's going to be hard to get a lot for him. A couple other guys, Sicily I mentioned, he's been, he's a player that isn't what he was in fantasy, but he's been pretty safe for 80s. And then the other one is Rory Laird. You might have to pay a bit more to get him in, but I think he'd be an awesome D1, D2 for a contender, and the sort of guy that if you're not contending and you have him, you should look to cash in now, because it doesn't take long for these names to go from having some trade value to dropping off the cliff and being worth very little. It does happen quickly. In terms of what draft capital to give up, Ray, I mean, you've got to, if you're going for the right now, you've got to be willing to part with draft picks. They're a big part of unlocking these sorts of trades with a contender and a side that's rebuilding. I guess it depends who you target and who you're going for, but I'm always pretty happy to part with any of my draft picks if I'm chasing a flag. But I guess, unless you're getting a Whitfield or, an absolute top of the line guy, I probably wouldn't give up your first round pick for, a Short or, one of those guys I mentioned. But, I reckon you'll have to give up a player if you want to get one of those big boys like Zorko or Whitfield, for sure. And then Ray also asked, what would you be offering up in a trade for Lloyd? He's interesting, Jake Lloyd, because I think we all thought he was done, and he is very much up on a wing with the likes of Roberts and Bice and Blakey very much taking over that back line. But he's been scoring pretty well, Lloyd. I think with Lloyd, I probably wouldn't go for him. He could be someone you could get at D4, D5 if you really don't give up much. But the problem with trying to get Lloyd at the moment, and I think he might have had a poor score on the weekend, but he's had some pretty decent scores this year, and he has the name factor. So if I'm a coach trying to sell Lloyd, I'm selling the name and the fact that he's still got some decent scores against his name this year. So I'm not sure a coach would give him up for peanuts. But if you were to go for it, it would be, with him as your D4, D5 in mind. So you wouldn't be giving up a lot. So thanks for putting that one through, Ray. And that is it for the questions. Thank you, everyone that sent in theirs this week. And don't forget, if you want to send in a question or even just a trade idea, a trade from the past you would love me to read out on the podcast, just go to @FindKeepAFL on X and post on the wall, or you can send a private message to the page just if you want to remain anonymous and you don't want anyone in your league to know that it's you asking the question. I can keep your name classified if you would like. Anyway, send through your questions, any thoughts on the podcast, any feedback you have. We are a third of the way through the season, and I am trying to improve this podcast every week. And with your feedback, I will be able to do it in a way that makes the podcast exactly what you want it to be. That'll do it for this week. We are pushing the hour mark and my mouth is getting very dry. Time to get a glass of water, I think. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you for the support for the podcast so far. If you are enjoying the show, and obviously like and subscribe or wherever you're listening, but do one other thing for me. Tell your friends. If you've got mates who you think would benefit from this and would enjoy it the way you are, share it with them. I'd really appreciate it if you did. Good luck for the week ahead as we prepare for round 9. I hope you get the players you want from the pool in your waiver wire pickups, and I hope you get a win in all your leagues across the weekend. I'll be back next Tuesday and we can do it all again. But in the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers. And until next time, keep on keeping on.